Today we're going to be talking about structuralism and functionalism, which were the two first schools of thought in psychology. And so our next couple weeks in this class are going to be dominated by these different schools of thought. So what is a school of thought? Well, a school of thought is an organizing idea, principle, or theory that helps guide our research practices. So it informs what research questions we ask, it informs our research methods, it informs our interpretation of the results, and it basically is this overarching idea of what most people in the field are thinking about. And so in the beginning of psychology, there was a debate between structuralism and functionalism, which were the first two schools of thought. So on one side, you have structuralism, and this was really pioneered by Wilhelm Wundt. We talked a little bit about it when we talked about Wundt, but structuralism was our first major school of thought, obviously, since it was from the founder of psychology. And it utilized the introspection techniques that we got familiar with when we learned about Wundt. Which means that the results kind of lacked this reliability. We didn't know if the results were independent of what people were thinking, but structuralism was really this idea that we were focused on the structure of the mind. So how does the brain work? How does the mind work? And how does that lead us to certain thoughts and behaviors? So as we've learned with the Wundt chapter, this looks a little bit like present-day cognitive psychology, where we're looking at perceptions, we're looking at impulses, reaction times, things like that to really uncover how the brain is working, what that structure is, and what that structure is leading to. On the other hand, you have functionalism, and this was really pioneered by William James, who again, around the same time as Wundt, so it kind of became a debate between the two as they fought in the pages of journals and books about this school of thought. And functionalism was a little bit more focused on the purpose of behavior. So rather than just uncovering the structure of the mind, functionalism was a little bit more worried about, well, what function does this serve us, right? So if we have a particular behavior or we have a particular thought, what function is that serving for the individual? And this school of thought really emphasized a little bit more individual differences. So with Wundt and structuralism, you were looking for kind of that common denominator. What's the average of reaction times for a certain perception, right? So we're looking at what most people would do or think or behave in a certain situation in order to uncover that structure. Whereas functionalism, because it matters what function that's serving the individual, it leads to a lot more individual differences that we can see in participants. This also kind of influenced the educational system. James himself was married to a school teacher, and so he did a lot of outreach with K through 12 kind of education at the time, or what we would now call K through 12 education. And he brought forth this idea of functionalism, of what function does the learning have for the student, and how do we utilize that function in order to better help the student learn. You can see how this would work in clinical type of environment where they're looking at a certain person's behavior and how that behavior is not adaptive for them and how to make it functional in their life. So structuralism, functionalism, you can see they're kind of completely different. This argument still exists in psychology today as well. It's a little bit more this idea of science for application's sake, or for science sake, if you will. Structuralism, right? We're uncovering thoughts and behaviors in the mind and how people work simply to know how that works, right? Simply to understand what's going on. That's kind of science for science sake. That's still holding on a little bit to that structuralism point of view. And then we have functionalism, which is a little bit more that science for application's sake. What benefit is this having for other people? How do we actually apply this information and get behavior to change? You can also see structuralism, functionalism in the other schools of thought that we're going to explore later. So you'll see a lot of kind of functionalism in behaviorism, where we're looking at how to create behaviors, how to manipulate behaviors to serve a purpose, to get people to a certain behavioral endpoint. And you'll see a lot of structuralism in cognitive psychology, where we're looking at this structure of the brain, the localization of brain areas, and things like that. So you can see how schools of thought can be really important to a discipline. They are guiding what people are learning, how people are understanding what we're learning in psychology, and they're guiding really everything that a researcher is doing. And so a school of thought, if we don't understand what school of thought we have, that's when our biases can kind of creep in to the research process and cause a bit of problems, which we'll explore later in the semester. But right now, it's just important to understand that there are different schools of thought, and these two are the very first ones. Structuralism, beginning with Wundt, and functionalism, beginning with James. And then we'll move on to kind of humanism and Gestalt and some other major schools of thought next.